here at Hostos in the media design programs. And I have had the pleasure of working with Professor Ian Charles Scott over the last 4 years that I've been here. A great friend, a wonderful colleague, an amazing teacher, and obviously an incredible artist. And it's such an honor to be up here and be able to share with you this amazing work that he's done. And so what we're going to do is I'm just going to kind of go. I've got 5 questions to ask Ian, and hopefully he can respond to them. And then we'll open up the floor to the audience, and we invite any questions, especially from students. We always want to hear from you, okay? So, Ian, without further ado, first have a round of applause for Ian. So to get a better sense of who you are, as the title of the show implies, you are from Wick, Scotland.
Yes.
And for someone like myself who has never been to the Scottish Highlands, can you paint us a picture of Wick with words?
Yes.
What is Wick like?
Wick. Yes, now, Wick, the very name itself, Wick, the centre of a candle, a thing with no flim-flam, that thin bit of string that burns along, and in many ways Wick is like that. It's a small place, but big in nature. There's about 10,000 people live there altogether. It's a place where the very act of going down the street to buy a newspaper can take anywhere between 2 to 4 hours due to the number of people that are going to stop you, talk to you, and want to know everything about you, and also imagine that they know everything about you. They know everything about your family, your distant relatives. They know about relatives that you don't even know you've got. So that's being a local to the place. I mean, it's an extraordinary kind of setup. It also is a very gritty place. I mean, it's a place that's quite unforgiving in many ways. I think if I had stayed there, it would have been impossible to grow up as an artist. I think it would have been very difficult. There are places where it would be much easier nearby, like Orkney, which had a local poet who was well celebrated by the locals. But Wick, it's a fairly gritty place. I mean, you have to know who you are and get along with things. However, I've always found it an inspiring place for some reason. I think it was either one of those things where it was going to be a place that was a dreadful drawback in life, or you were going to transform it. So it would be like being born handicapped. Basically, you're in the middle of nowhere. It literally is at the top northeast part of Scotland, which is one of the most remote parts of Europe. When you take the train to get to Wick, well, if you take it from London, it just goes on and on and on and on and on, and you never think you're going to get there. I've had friends come all that way. Even from Edinburgh, which I guess most of you have heard of, or Glasgow, the 2 principal cities of Scotland, it still takes 8 hours to get to Wick. And you travel through a landscape which time has forgotten. In many places on that train journey, no man has set foot for centuries. It's just literally empty, barren moorland, very spooky. Wick is also surrounded by a series of ancient castles. This is all available on the great worldwide web. So if you want to spider your way into that machine, you can find the castle of Sinclair and Girnigle, Wick, where it's built on the cliff edge, and it's where the son of the castle was put into a dungeon. I think his father didn't like him at all, and he fed him salt beef and no water, so he drowned to death. And when you go down into that castle now, with strike a match, and there, in the luminous gloom, you can see the last words he scratched on the wall of that dungeon. Nae, no hope. So it's a spooky place, it's an interesting place, and it's a place that kind of made me who I am. But I wouldn't say it was a particularly easy place, Sarah, but it has a beautiful nature, and the people are genuine, which is something I've always liked. And in fact, the fellow in the small painting here, can you see it? There's a bald-headed gentleman with it's very grey, except he's got a red head. That was what you would call the local character. His name was George Robertson, but because he kept having saliva coming out of his mouth, he was known locally to the locals as Slavering Geordie. And Slavering Geordie was this kind of archetypal figure that I grew up with. He was walking the streets, and I grew to like him. I was terrified of him as a child because he was a huge, hulking man, about almost 6.5 feet tall and big. And I was terrified of him. But as I became a teenager and started drawing, the only people that would sit and model for me were the outsiders, you know, the people who were handicapped, or people who were known as tinks. The tinks or tinkers. You might have heard of them. They're like gypsies, but they've settled down, and you know, they're kind of like a class apart in the area. You know, most people don't mix with them, but I used to always mix with the tinks. I like the tinks. So I would draw them, and I would draw George, and those were my models, the people who were outsiders and you know, unliked by the general population. So that was Wick for me, Sarah. We've not gone on too long with it.
Thank you. So we're hearing about Wick, and you've made this journey here to be in the South Bronx, Mott Haven. So what has this geographic and cultural shift been for you, and how has this influenced your work?
Yes, well, you know, I had planned to come to America for years. You know, that was the first thing. I mean, it wasn't specifically the Bronx, but when I was a child, we moved from England to Wick, the famous Wick. And strangely enough, within about 6 months of moving to this obscure geographical location, my mother compelled me to enter a Walt Disney drawing competition, worldwide drawing competition. I'm serious. She kept at me to draw, and I would do these. It involved. I was 5 years old. So all I can vaguely remember is it involved rabbits, bears, and some other animals of some sort. And but my handwriting was diabolical, so my mother made me keep changing my handwriting, and eventually we sent it in. And miraculously, I won the first prize, which was a remarkable thing. 5 years old. The prize was quite well. It was a trip to Disneyland, and this dates me considerably. It was a trip to Disneyland. It was the only one that existed in Anaheim, and it was to meet Walt Disney, the man himself, and to be shown around Disneyland by Walt Disney. So, I mean, I just took this for granted. I mean, I'm confirming that I've arrived in Wick, and already I'm going to meet Walt Disney. So all these things affect a child's brain. And, but unfortunately, my brother was a newly born baby, and it was impossible for us to fly. I mean, flying in those days was not the simple thing, you know. Now, it was a tremendous flight with a propeller-driven aircraft over Iceland, and down over and stopping somewhere in America. Anyway, a long journey. So we didn't get it, and we took things called premium bonds. Well, I didn't take them, you know, the family. Premium bonds instead, you know, and these premium bonds are basically a lottery. You never get interest on the money, but every month you get a chance of winning money. And within about a month, the premium bonds had won even more money. And all this went to my head, you know. My God, you can make money with this art, and also America kind of went in my brain, you know, it's all this kind of stuff together. Walt Disney, art, money, America, bang. So, anyway, wind on the camera for 30 years. If any of you were at the opening last 2 weeks ago, there was a gentleman and his wife who turned up here, Alistair Salveson and Elizabeth, and believe it or not, that man is the richest man in Scotland, and you know, his garden is about the size of New York. I was amazed, you know, I went right there, I didn't realise how well off they were, but I won his art prize, and I made it to America, And that was where I chose to go, of course, only 30 years later from when I was 5. And I was taking the train around the United States. You get on a train in Chicago. 5 days later, you get out of the train in Los Angeles or somewhere like that. You're absolutely exhausted. The train, 18 hours late is nothing. But I was taking the train from Los Angeles. I was going to go up to Las Vegas, but the air conditioner broke down on the train. And I don't know if you know that route. It's actually through a desert. And being Scottish and not used to the heat, I mean, I was like one of those, ice. How much further is it going to be? I said, it's another 700 or 800 miles, sir. I said, well, I can't do it. Where's the next stop? The next stop, sir, is Anaheim. I said, Anaheim? What the hell is that famous for? It's famous as the home of Disneyland. And that was fate, because I got out in Anaheim. And I got into a motel called the Magic Lamp Motel with a flashing genie. And I woke up in the morning with this genie still flashing. And I was the first man in the line to get to Disneyland. I went in to Mr. Toad's Magic Ride, and then Peter Pan and all this bloody stuff. Anyway, I was there from 8 o'clock in the morning until it closed at 2 o'clock at night, and there was an absolute headache. But that was me started off in America. Now, I'd come here to the Bronx by sheer chance. I mean, it was, I was working in Yonkers, standing in for teachers who were on strike. And one of the teachers who was with me knew somebody who worked in Hostos. And he said, they're looking for somebody who teaches art, and you should get in touch with them. And I thought, well, it's a remote chance. So I did, and the rest is history. I just came in here on an off chance. And the words of the then boss, Magda Vasilov, was, for God's sake, speak slowly. They won't understand a word you're saying. And they don't. I mean, the one difference between Brits and Americans, I mean, I'm not generalizing, I mean, you grossly. They're very, we're quite used to the nuances of pronunciation of the English language. Whereas here, unless you have a particular nuance, I don't mean the words or the understanding, but unless you have a particular nuance, it goes right over their head. So, I mean, I knew this was happening because when I arrived here, there was a film called Snatch on an English director that has Brad Pitt in it. And I was in a photography shop in Manhattan, and this rather good-looking woman said to me, gee, you're just like Brad Pitt. And I thought, oh, that's me, I'm sorted. Yeah, you don't look like him. You sound just like him in that film Snatch. And have you seen it? He plays an Irish gypsy. Have you seen it? And his deal was that he didn't want to learn a word of dialogue in the film. So he did the whole thing of like, so he does the whole thing with this flim-flam, so he doesn't have to learn one single word of dialogue. So anyway, miraculously, people here in Hostos seem to understand me perfectly well. I've never changed my accent. I refuse to. And so it's been a nice melting pot for me to be here. I mean, I am probably, as different as anybody who's stepped through the doors of Hostos and love it very much. So I feel privileged to have, it's random. I mean, it's pure chance. I mean, I've worked in other places in America. I worked in the Maryland Institute College of Art before I came here, and I can tell you this is infinitely preferable to that institute. Nice as it was, I prefer it here. It's much more human. That's it. Thank you.
Great. We're obviously privileged to have Ian with us. Lucky coincidence. So the subtitle of the show is The Magic Realism of Ian Charles Scott. So, for those unfamiliar with the term magic realism, it's an art genre which incorporates fantastical elements into a seemingly real-life setting, a juxtaposition which draws the viewer through a dreamlike narrative. So, in this show's opening, on October 1st, Ian, you expressed some discomfort, at least that was my interpretation, of being confined to such art world terminology. And so I know as a visual artist myself, that it can be frustrating to live in a world where my preferred language is visual. And yet, I feel forced to categorize and express my work with spoken, and written words. And yet, most often, the verbal and written translations help viewers feel comfortable in this unknown, just what is going on in that crazy artist's brain. And so, I'm going to challenge you with empathy to put into words, what are you communicating visually? Who are the people in these paintings? Why are they in these settings? And if it's easiest, maybe we could just start with Damien and Joe. Pardon me.
Right.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks very much. Damien and Joe. Well, I mean, you've got to understand, I mean, these, there's 15 years worth of paintings here, with these ones being the earlier ones. And basically, I was transposing the same thing I'd done in Wick. These are all people that I met and got to know when I arrived here. These are the artists, Damien Loeb, and this is this fellow here.
Can't take the mic back and forth, so it's the old horse throat when I come over here. This is
Damien Loeb, and the bearded fellow is a man called Joe Coleman. And Sarah, they're both kind of different sides of my own psyche. Coleman, his books are available everywhere. I mean, he's kind of ubiquitous. Coleman is a funny guy. I mean, I'm not sure if it's real or it's an act. He dresses like a old general from the Civil War. I mean, he's got that kind of weird old guise. He got married in the Baltimore Museum of Fantastical Art or something like that. He was carried into the wedding ceremony in a wickerwork coffin. So all the work has got this kind of weird overtone to it, and he works with acrylics. He's more, I would say, an illustrator, but with an edge of real art about it. He works with magnifying glasses, things that he wears all day, and he paints, I would describe them as kind of like oddity. I mean, the oddities that I worked with were people who I had empathy with, and I got to know, whereas Joe works with kind of psychotics and serial killers, and these kind of people, are his food and outsiders. I mean, these killers can range from the more highbrow killers like Gesualdo, the composer, who found his wife in bed with her lover and proceeded to pierce them 100 times with his stiletto, and spent the rest of his life in penance writing these religious compositions. But that's Joe Coleman, who lives in Brooklyn. Damien Loeb, on the other hand, was quite, his work was all from photographs, and he became infamous for taking photographs by famous photographers and juxtaposing them. He had a photograph of two people being killed on a road in South Africa, and the car, that's one of the photographs he copied, and the car in front of it was a car full of kind of Californian beach kind of people going, all kind of groovy. So he put the two of them together like this kind of indifference. So I put the two of them there in this helicopter of my mind. The helicopter I saw in the Metropolitan, the other place, MoMA. Who said that? Thank you, thanks. The Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, and it's hanging from the ceiling. And one of the things I liked about America, or in this fantasy America that I came over with, from Scotland, was the television series MASH. And I always thought that I liked that, and I empathised with different characters. First of all, I was, of course, Alan Alda, that kind of really wild, kind of left-wing, kind of radical humour and not taking anything seriously. Then I started to empathise with Charles, the kind of snooty guy from Boston, but he becomes slowly more human and more real as the thing wears on. Instead of being this awful kind of pompous bastard, he becomes this human thing. So I mean, these are both sides. There's all sides of me. They're flying in a helicopter over in an imaginary Transylvania.
part of my background of before I studied art, I studied filmmaking, and I worked for a place in London that did special effects for, I mean, this is pre-computers, you know, and you really had to bloody think with numbers and all these machines, and we used to do film commercials, and basically we only ever did change colours in some feature films, and we did opening titles for some feature films. So it was what they call an optical house. It wasn't a brilliant place, but I was interested in films made by a British company called Hammer Horror Films, and they were low budget, but they always had this high key colour in their films. I don't know what film stock they used, if it was some sort of form of Kodachrome or something like that, but when Dracula or Frankenstein appeared in their 1959 version of Frankenstein, played by Christopher Lee, and he's revealed, and he has this absolutely stark, kind of like ghastly, decayed kind of tissue, and it's very bright when it comes on the screen. And that, I used to sneak in to see these films, as they were X films. You had to be 16, and I used to go to them when I was about 10. I used to wear a big jumper and about 3 or 4 jackets. I used to come in like Billy Bunter, or a Womble, or what do they call them, a Teletubby. I used to walk in like this. How old are you, sonny? I'm 16. Oh, well, if he says he's 16, let him in. And I'd sit there, sweating like a pig through these films. So this combines all that, the high key colour, the guys here, and it's also about male and female energy. Male energy is always kind of trying to ascend, you know, over things. You know, it's always kind of trying to glide over things, and female energy is trying to root us, you know, into the pattern of the world. So it's these male artists are sort of floating up here in the sky, and then the female here who's been kissing, lipstick, machine gunning the front of the helicopter. The female energy is holding it to try and stop the buggers floating away from the earth in their images. And so it's to do with male image making, and the female energy trying to stop them getting obsessed with their own egos and image making, and make them more rooted in the pattern of the earth. So that's about as much as I think I'm going to say about that one. Much to the chagrin.
Is there any other one you would like to point out and speak about? I chose one for you.
I can speak about a lot. I mean,
Pick one.
So this one over here is a kind of interesting one of the girl on the horse. When I arrived in America, New York, should we say, I feel that the infrastructure here is fantastically dangerous. I mean, compared to Britain, everything is wobbly and unstable. I mean, this is just my feeling. You know, I stayed in an apartment, and I always had the sensation that every time a car went past, the whole place was like one of these places on stilts. You know, it's shaking. You know, and it's something I realised. You know, part of the instability of the place is it's got a very poor infrastructure, and this was proven to me when I went out on a walk when I arrived here into Central Park. And those horses, are they still going around, or have they banned them yet? They're still going around. Well, one of the horses was going along, and I was walking along, and this poor horse stepped on top of a manhole cover, and it was electrocuted. But it must have been a tremendous force went through it, because it went shooting right ahead, and there was smoke. I mean, can you imagine seeing this with your eyes? There was smoke coming off the body of this poor beast as it went shooting along after it got God knows how many million volts into it. Like the way they tried to electrocute that poor elephant at Coney Island. Have you ever seen that on YouTube when they were trying to do the Edison proving that ACD or whatever it was? Anyway, this thing went shooting along, and then it collapsed and died. You could smell it. And so this is when I arrived, you know, and I was interested in these horses. I went over from that to look in the Museum of the Smithsonian, what's it called? The place where they all come to life at night and they make films. No, the other one, Natural History. Natural History, and they had a display of Buddhist sculptures. And there was a sculpture of the goddess Shakti. She rides a horse naked, which has a male skinned, and he is used as the saddle. And I'm putting the electricity coming through her there in her leaf body. At the same time, I popped over, this is another day later, I popped over to the synagogue on 70th Street or something, it's around there. I went in to watch a screening of the famous silent film Der Golem, which it was free. It was a wonderful experience, and it had music being played by a Jewish, I don't know what they call them, a zither band or something like that, but they were playing this wonderful accompaniment with it, the movie. And I went out, and there's a black kind of golem moving through the undergrowth there. Can you see him just in there? Just at the side, that little figure there. So that was the golem coming from the synagogue and wandering around. I'm not going to explain the whole story of a golem, but it's just basically it's a thing they make out of clay, and it comes to life, and it's used to protect the city. So that was the golem coming there, and everything is based on things that I saw over the period. The ball with the woman riding the horse. It's not made up. I actually saw that. I was walking near a fairground in Shenzhen in China. It was a beautiful night. One of those nights of absolute paramount stillness. Not a sound to be heard, the trees just gentle in the air. And as I was walking along there, minding my own business, suddenly a noise penetrated the silence. There was a woman riding a stark white horse, and she was dressed in Mongolian costume, and over her back was a Kalashnikov machine gun. God only knows what she was doing, but I wasn't drunk or hallucinating, it really happened. She was riding past, so I put her inside the kind of Hieronymus Bosch ball there. So it's an amalgam of all these things. But I'm not the most logical painter. If I was a very wise painter, I'd be sitting on a fortune by now. But I'm not the most logical painter. For instance, that unfinished painting that we put up there, which you can see, I've managed to find this on my camera. I didn't realise I'd painted underneath it, and then pass it around. Yes, I'd painted an entirely different scene underneath it. Only the body of one of the figures remains, and even it is in the process of being destroyed. I was talking to somebody today. I said I'm painting over a Western face with a Chinese face for a show that I'm supposed to be having in Beijing in about 2 years. And he said, well, one day, they're going to be X-raying those paintings. You've painted Chinese faces over a Western face for a show in Beijing. It was sheer expediency. I've got to say, part of the job of being an artist is unfortunately sheer survival. I haven't, apart from that Disneyland win, I didn't have any support to be an artist from my family. In fact, my father's ambition for me was to become a captain of oil tank, to go to a navigation school in Edinburgh and become a captain of oil tankers sailing from Scotland to Japan. He said it's a great job. You just have to sit there, get paid a lot of money, and you get your own apartment in the ship. You sit there for 6 months, you arrive in Japan, and then you head the way back, and you can even take your wife and family if you want to. That was his idea. Maybe that would have been a good idea, rather than this peripatetic artist. But they're all every single painting here could be a long and. These are two other art critics. It's artists and art critics from New York. It's Damien Loeb and Charlie Finch, who's a huge Falstaffian. And if you know Shakespeare, you know who Falstaff is. He's the big fella, art critic. He's a kind of bête noir of the Manhattan art scene, because basically he just says whatever comes into his mind. And as you know, the mind is a kind of cesspit, so most of it is not very nice stuff. So that's Charlie Finch, who actually likes my work. I was amazed, and so I put him in one of the paintings. This one here is, A lot of this stuff, what's come in with Hostos, is more of a Hispanic influence into the work. And something with the magic realism I kind of hinted on was that Hispanic art, it's not cool, you know, and cool is a misused word. I mean, I'm like a steam train just now, you know, basically. I'm not a diesel or a petroleum thing. I'm like a steam train. There's steam kind of coming out of me, you know, you can feel it. So I'm not really a cool character. I'm kind of overheated, but it's my way of getting along. And I liked Hispanic art because it's not cool either, and I don't think true Scottish art is cool either. Cool to me is like always being self-conscious, and I think self-conscious is the disease of the modern generation. They're too self-conscious, and self-conscious has come at a cost, which is self-awareness. And you know, all this world now of what they call them selfies, you know, that was a word that's now in the Webster's dictionary. It didn't exist until iPhone 4 when they started taking these selfies. And I mean, what's the word that I think of? Selfie, selfish. And it's like people are getting sort of like narcissists, you know. It's like you become obsessed with your own face in the pool, and the moment you come to kind of like love your face, it disappears from the pool. These selfies, apart from the arm that's connecting you to it, kind of make us part of this eternal kind of love affair with ourselves. But it's a very shallow pool. You know, what it does is destroy self-awareness. I was looking at a photograph today before I came here of this Kardashian. Thank God it hasn't managed to appear on television in Britain, but the Kardashian woman, the main one, the one that's continuously altering herself with surgery, who's married, is it Kanye West or someone like that? Kanye. Well, I never get the names right, do I? Anyway, she's married to him, and there was a photograph of them where she's holding a baby, presumably their baby, and she's got a camera on one of these phones photographing them. I mean, she's holding it in a totally non-maternal way. She's photographing the scene. Meanwhile, I want to vomit. You know, I don't want to vomit. But have you ever known? I mean, it's horrible when you're vomiting, but after you vomit, don't you feel better? Yes. In some ways, the paintings are like protracted vomits. I'm a person who is incredibly angry, and you know, it seems an incredible nightmare that we have to create this world the way it is instead of the way it should be. There's something wrong, and that's what agitates me as an artist. And if it doesn't agitate you as a human being, there's something wrong with you, because this world should be working for us. It should really be a healthy universe where people are looked after. We don't spend a tremendous amount of thinking and effort and energy on incredible inventions designed to eliminate each other constantly. And these selfies are being used right now by the likes of ISIS and God knows what else, you know, and they're very technically efficient. But the world as it is creates a rage inside me. Now, thank God I've got the peace. And I don't want to be one of those kind of like pissed off people walking around, you know, like, oh, fuck, you know, there's enough of those people. It doesn't make it any better. You somehow have to take that stuff that you've got inside you and somehow transform it, you know, and it's not easy. You somehow take, like an alchemist, you take the raw materials of the horribleness inside you and you transform it. I was just thinking of an example. I know you maybe have another question, but I was looking, I don't know if any of you saw that film a couple of years ago, A Dangerous Method. Did anyone see that? With Michael Fassbender, who's the young Magneto, and Keira Knightley. It's basically the story of Carl Gustav Jung and Freud. And they have this woman who comes in as a patient. It's in Vienna in the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And this woman is in a completely insane. I mean, basically, when you watch it, I mean, she's ripping off all her clothes and running around, and it just looks like someone who is heading for the asylum. it turns out that she is, through consultation with Jung mainly, who becomes her lover, she is suffering because she suffered at the hands of her father, who spanked her backside. And she had tremendous shame from this experience because she became sexually excited while her father was spanking her. And she could not cope with that shame. I mean, it was a tremendous thing inside her, this awful feeling. So she became effectively insane. Now, the film is worth seeing, because the therapy that Jung administrates is exactly the same thing that she suffered from. And it's a true story. You expect the next thing to see that, she's just worse, or something like that. But she became the world's leading female psychoanalyst. She actually managed, the next thing you see her stepping out of the university with her doctor's degree and transforming. Unfortunately, the tragic end of that lady is that she was killed in the concentration camp in the 1940s. But, it was that. What the purpose of the story is that these unfathomable shames that we have inside us, and I believe we all have them. We all have deep, dark, dirty secrets inside us. We don't want to go around talking about it. It's not necessary to go around talking about it. Artists, thank God, can communicate it in paint, but there are many ways to deal with these things. You don't need to hang out your laundry to be seen by all the, everybody. You can work on it inside yourself. But I think unless we actually learn how to do that, all that we have are the appearances. So when we talked about magic realism and surrealism, they're almost like, they give people an idea and it gives them an appearance. These paintings are appearances, but really for me I've designed them as traps. I mean, the closer you look at these paintings, you'll find little things going on inside them, like books that they're reading, or little things in the parachute that are parables, or tiny things in the face. There's lots of little clues going on in there to encourage you to kind of go beneath the surface, not just to become a superficial, self-conscious person, living your life, to do the act of what you think other people want you to be. I mean, isn't that very restricting? How do we find out how to be ourselves if we're constantly always thinking, and I do it, so I'm sure that you do it, oh, these people will, if I do this way, they'll like me. So you do it, and you think, and then after a while you think, Jesus, I'm being totally false to myself. And then you get angry, and then you wonder why you're angry, and it's because you're not really being true. And what I'm looking for in these paintings is my truth. And if I can find my truth in these paintings, I'm not talking about the global truth. A tiny little bit of truth is all that I can expect. And I want to find my truth in these paintings. And if it triggers something in the viewer to kind of like start searching for their truth, that's great. I mean, I do it with the teaching, I do it with the classes. I'm not really teaching painting. I mean, I'm teaching people, I'm unlearning people to stop being so self-conscious of themselves and always thinking about what so-and-so thinks about me, or this person thinks about me, or that person thinks about me, or what I think about me, all that bullshit that you've got going on all the time. To release yourself from that trap so that you can actually find that nugget of truth inside yourself. And it's a hell of, I make it sound easy. It's a hell of a fucking job. Excuse me for swearing, but sometimes you need to do it in these things. It's a hell of a job doing that. I mean, I've been dedicated my life to it, and the paintings are the little bits of nuggets that I kind of discover along the way. These are the kind of things that I drag up from my unconscious in the process of the discovery. That's how I do that.
So, talking about digital imagery and selfies, so, we're dealing with pixels and we're dealing with light, and, I mean, how many people have ever taken a digital photograph in this room, right? How many people have worked on a painting before? Okay, so it's different. We're talking about physicality when we're talking about, when we're talking about a painting, and I'm not gonna, make Ian go all Bob Ross on us, but I want you to talk a little bit about your process. So obviously we're looking at brilliance, and you've talked a little bit about where these come from. But how do you grasp these ideas out there, come through your head, and then go out your arm? How does that happen? Do you do sketches? Do you start with pencils? Do you use photographs? For someone that's never used oils before, what is that medium? What does it feel? What is the tactical process that you go through? Briefly.
Okay. Yes, the tactical process. Briefly. There's a hint there. Yes, no, briefly. Yes, of course, the paint, the particular sort of medium that you use does affect the psychology of the painting. Oil paint can have many layers. In fact, the traditional oil painting technique is called glazing. The technique that I use is called glazing. I'm an artist who you could describe, we'll use the art world to talk. I'm not a gestural artist. Gestural artists are, when you see big brush strokes and it's all, like you judge the artist by the brush strokes. I'm not really one of those artists. A lot of Scottish artists were traditionally gestural artists. They were guys, and they were mainly guys, unfortunately. It's not a sexist thing, but it's just historically factual. They were kind of like one bottle of whiskey in one hand, the brush in the other hand, and it was kind of, I'm an artist, look at me. So all that stuff was going on. I'm not really that kind of artist. I'm using the combination of thinking and paint, and joining them together. So when I get sick of using a particular medium like oil paint, I usually switch to watercolor. And watercolor then has a different vibrancy altogether. Watercolor is on a white paper, so the white shows through, and it takes on a very kind of luminous tone compared to the oil paintings. If you look here, you can see the differences. I try to maintain that luminosity in both the types of mediums. I think the most important thing for an artist is not the mediums. In many ways, the crazy kind of artist image is just idiotic. I think to do a really good painting, you have to be very organized, with your colors and your palette and what you're using, so that you don't end up with what's called a muddy palette. In other words, you've got a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of that, and you don't clean the brush, or you don't use a fresh brush. You just, you're using one brush, and then you end up with a painting that lacks vibrancy, it lacks life, it lacks that energy of absolute brilliance. And so you have to be organized all the time, and it requires a kind of combination of being very acutely conscious, but also being able to let go of that consciousness so that you can go into the artistic process. The brain has got lots of images inside it. My brain is probably saturated with imagery, unfortunately. I'm one of those people from the age of 17, when I went to London to go to film school, would go to the cinema perhaps 2 or 3 times a day, and London has a lot of cinemas. I went to see every avant-garde film that was made in the Hayward Art Gallery when I was 17 or 18, I can't remember. But I went there every day, and I would watch maybe 10 or 20 films a day, and some of these films were bloody atrocious, I can tell you that, but I was addicted to it. Some of the films were about nothing, literally just winding on, a leader going through it. Some of the films were about just water moving. They were abstract films, but done by artists. So I spent a long time going to see these things. And this kind of informs the work. Losing track of what I was trying to say, actually. But so imagery is pumping through my head all the time. I'll start off doing a painting with drawings, photographs, scraps of paper that I found from newspapers, magazines, garbage that I found I mean, I'm a hell of a person to walk around the streets with, that I found on the street, memories of things that I've seen. If I can actually get a model in there, which is hard nowadays to get someone to actually sit still for more than 5 minutes, you know. I mean, there aren't many people sitting in ateliers, paint, you know, like Picasso with the, you know, this is all bullshit now. So you have to use whatever kind of expedient. I actually sometimes build, you know, I find if I get too complex, it's usually the painting is going wrong. You know, last year I started doing a recreation of a railway station, and I had to build part of the railway station in a little model and put it into the studio. And I had a kind of feeling when I was doing this that this was far too much effort for what I was going to get at the end of it. And sure enough, you know, with detachment, which took me about a year, I went back this last month and I painted over everything. I'm talking about pages of work. I literally painted over all of this thing that I'd recreated. I buried it in asphalt on this thing, and you could just see little bits of it. But this is part of what you call pentimento. Have you heard of that term? Pentimento is the term which means the artist repenteth. In other words, you look at a painting and maybe there's a lovely sunset, and as you look closer, suddenly you can see a kind of big moose or something through the paint. That's the artist repented. You know, he thought, oh no, I'm not going to have that moose there. It's too strange, and I'll paint that nice sunset over it. So I do a lot of repenting. You know, I'm I think it's the Scottish persecution complex. You know, I keep repenting myself. I mean, oh God, I'll change that. It's not right. And so there's a lot of that going on with it, Sarah. But the basic process is I'll use anything that comes my way. I mean, I've got if I need something, I'll buy it. A few years ago, that was a hell of a hassle because it meant scouring around old buildings, old flea markets, old places that sold weird things. Now, thanks to this is one thing I like about the internet, eBay, you can find the most obscure things. I was painting a fencer in a fencing mask. It's one of the few self-portraits, because I mean, I can't stand looking at it. You know, I'm not that bad, but I can't be bothered looking at myself constantly, painting myself. But I did a self-portrait, so I went to eBay, and you know, I mean, finding a fencer's mask would be a quite difficult thing in ordinary circumstances. But just type in fencer's mask, and I ended up buying 3 of the things. You know, I bought a modern one, which was quite good, and then I bought this one from the 18th century, which was a hell of a rusty thing, but it looked perfect. I actually put these, and thank God I didn't get tetanus. I was actually wearing these things while I was painting it. There's a YouTube video of me wearing it, actually, which was a nightmare in my studio. But I mean, I would buy these things. I was painting rabbits dancing around. Alistair Salveson, who was here last week, commissioned me to do a painting of him and the wife. And I noticed one thing in their grounds of their luxury house. They had lots of rabbits. And so I put rabbits all around them. At the end of eBay, I ended up buying these rabbits. They make, for fishing, you can put a rabbit's ear. I mean, God knows what kind of fish you catch with it. A rabbit's ear on the end of the line. Hey, I'm going to catch some fish. Rabbit's ears. And so I bought these ears, stinking bloody ears, hare's ears came there through the post. They were lying in the back there. So you can end up with a rooster, which is still in, George uses that regularly. That's the most painted rooster in the world. That bloody old rooster, $45 from eBay. A lot of the stuff ends up here in the college. So you end up back, you know, I buy things. The Buddhist monk there, I had, look, I'm not conventionally religious. I don't follow any religion, and there was aspects of Buddhism that I liked, and I got a lot out of, but I would not describe myself as a Buddhist. But I went there religiously every week to hear his talks, his Dharma talks, which were translated by an instant translation from Taiwanese into English. And the only way, anyone who witnessed me during my tenure in the Senate The 7 Years in the Senate. It's a new book I'm writing, by the way. My 7 Years in the Senate by I.C. Scott. Anybody who witnessed me in the Senate will vividly remember one of the ways I got through it was by sketching. Remember this? And we've been drawing everyone, the Polish fellow, Bronowski or whatever, he was a Dumpty, or the old Alexander saying, you don't know who these people are, but we know them because we've been working with them for 15 years. So I've been drawing their faces and it would keep me in my seat. So I'm always drawing and always learning about things. So I would draw him, and that was the only way I could understand what the hell he was talking about with all these Four Noble Truths and the perfect land and the Dharma drum and all this stuff. It was the only way I could relate to it. So I was drawing him compulsively every week. I also managed to get a photograph of him, which explains some of the extra detail. But I would literally, in some cases, when you were doing a detailed drawing and you couldn't photograph them, I would have a book. I remember working in a warehouse when I never had much money, so when I was a student I had to get up at 5:30 in the morning and work in a warehouse. And I worked with a forklift truck driver called Charlie, and Charlie had a very interesting old rugged face. So I had a copy of Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, his First World War memoirs. And paperback books have got all those blank, they haven't quite got enough sheets, so there were all these blank pages in it. So I would pretend to be reading or making, studious notes of an intellectual. Well, in fact, every day I would draw. To get this kind of detail, you can't do it all at once. I would draw one part of the man. One day I would draw the eye, the next day I would draw the bulbous nose with all the holes in infinite detail. The next day I would draw the mouth, and eventually he twigged. He came marching over towards me, a big bugger. He said, "I know what you're doing." I said, "Oh yes." "You're drawing me, aren't you?" It was like fee fi fo fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. I said, quaking in my wee shoes, I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, why the hell don't you just ask me to pose? I used to be an artist myself." And he gave me the hat, he gave me the bloody uniform that he was wearing. He was fantastic. So, in your mind, you create frightening scenes, and people are usually not as bad as you expect once you engage with them. So the process is multifarious, Sarah, and I know it's not a swift response, but you never get swift with me.
That's the process.
That's the process.
That's the process.
So 2 things for the students, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all for questions. And again, we'd love to hear from the students. First, something that Ian said, I thought it stuck out to me was, you didn't necessarily have that, support from the family going forth as an artist. And I myself had that same thing. And maybe many of you creative individuals out there feel the same way. Your family's worried about you making money. Find a way to make money. But the problem is you will never be able to stop making stuff. It is within you, and it is going to keep happening. So students, if you can find that way to talk to your family about that, and promise you will make money, but that is who you are, and you can't stop you can't stop making. You will always create. The next thing I was going to say is Ian taking notes in drawing, aka doodling. There's a lot on the internet right now about the power of doodling, and I ask that all teachers in here forgive students for doodling, and not so much forgive them, but embrace it, because it actually helps them remember things more. So they're listening to you, but they're listening to you better by drawing, I promise. Okay, students, and then anybody else? Any questions for Ian? We'll keep it kind of brief. Yes?
You've been teaching here, and I wonder, have you ever had any students who are accomplished graffiti artists?
Graffiti? Yes, we've had a few. In fact, we had one boy who'd, I forgot his name actually, he'd been arrested, not in my class, I'm glad to say, but he was a compulsive graffitiist. I mean, I think there's still bits and pieces of his around the room, because he would do it on all sorts of nooks and crannies. He was a very good artist in his own right. Yeah, I mean, in fact, one of the students, do you know there's another exhibit here of 5 students that I've chosen from 15 years of teaching in Hostos? And one of the students, the Danessa, she has got a graffiti-esque kind of style to her work. Yes, I mean it's a form of art. We had graffiti artists here in the Bronx. Oh, about was it before you came, Sarah? They published a book about, it was just slightly before you came. I remember they had a big talk in here. There was a fantastic book published by Rizzoli, the art book publishers. So it was very indigenous to the area, and there was also a man working with the Black Studies, whose name escapes me. Not Weldon, no, he was an artist, a graffiti artist working with them, and he painted the back wall in Weldon. What was his name? Yes, I think I can hear you. It struck a bell. Yeah, he was here for a while, and he was actually teaching. I'm not a graffiti artist, so I mean, it's not a special. I mean, it's. Although I have had my moments when I was a boy of doing naughty things in Wick. There was a statue of the local historian. This is a bad story, but written on it was erected by public subscription in 1893, and I, as a 14 or 13-year-old, had inserted in exactly perfect letters, as they had on the statue, above the word erected, another word. Not going to tell you what it is, but that graffiti remained for 15 years. I remember. So I understand the thrill of graffiti art. I mean, it's anti-establishment, and you're wanting to leave your mark. And I always called myself when I did these things, I called myself a constructive graffiti artist. I invented a political party, and I made called lino cuts. And in Scotland, I based it on kind of George Orwell, but it all went wrong. So I ended up calling them the Welsh Pig Nationalists. It was absolutely absurd, and we made thousands of these hundreds of posters, and we put them all over Wick at night. So I understand. Basically, what I'm trying to say is I have great empathy with the psychology of a graffiti artist. I don't like a lot of it, but some of it I do like. But I don't buy books on graffiti art and look at them. I mean, it doesn't really turn me on, I've got to say, and you have to be true to yourself. There's oblique examples I might like, but a lot of it is too glib and superficial, and it doesn't dig deeply enough. But I understand the anti-establishment emotion behind them. That's all I can say. George.
I just want to make a comment on graffiti art because I think one of the reasons why
it can backfire on you, though. I was just going to say another thing I did was there's a local newspaper in Wick called the John O'Groats Journal, and I used to collage onto them. I mean, like there'd be the local sheepdog farmers' trials dance, and I would find photographs of naked sumo wrestlers, black and white, and kind of perfectly collage them onto the newspaper and other kind of weird stuff, and then go and surreptitiously put these newspapers back into the newsagents among the pile of, actual newspapers. And little did I know, I was sitting back in the house kind of relishing this, and my mother came in, and she had the very same newspaper under her arm, with new sumo wrestlers, and she said, "Mrs. Sinclair," that's the owner of the shop, "Mrs. Sinclair said you left this in the shop." So you may well think that you're getting off with it, but everything was being noticed. One thing about Wick that's important, it's a harbour town. I didn't mention this. A harbour town, according to Jungian psychology, relating back to what I was talking about with the woman who'd suffered from years the shame of the spanking. A harbour town is a female town. It's going in, it's a female energy. And Wick is very much ruled by what are known as old wifeys, old ladies. You know, they watch everything you do. They'll have your entire, you know, life, past, present, and future summed up with one glance. So it's a very, you know, this Mrs. Sinclair and my mum and all these figures, you know, you very much watched. One of the paintings, it's not here unfortunately, was the one I did when I first arrived in America, where I depicted myself kind of like as a cowboy riding on a horse with a big, you know, like a typical American with a big stogie in my mouth, you know, like that. And behind me, though, is a rather prim Scottish old wifey on a big poster, watching, you know. So it's that kind of feeling, you know, the graffiti and the naughtiness. I've got that still in me, so it's always going to be seen. I'm always going to be caught out, you know, when I'm doing the naughtiness. But I can empathise with your guy. Sorry.
Yeah, I was struck when you described painting as your way of getting at what you call your truth. And
Yes.
how you also describe your paintings as traps, which seems an apt description of them.
Yes.
In a lot of different ways. And that seemed to me a very oblique or indirect way of getting your truth.
I found it's been necessary. I mean, I'm a different person than I was 30 years ago. I mean, I have a very thick velvet glove on me now. There were people, I had a studio in the World's End, which is an appropriate name. It's the top of the King's Road in London. And that was a very exciting time, actually, because you've probably not heard of the Sex Pistols. You might have, yeah? Okay, so I mean, I knew all those people. Malcolm McLaren and Vivian Westwood. I used to go to their shop, which had a giant clock in front of it that ran backwards. It was just right from my studio. And, you know, the traps are, I suppose, you know, back in those days, someone would come into my studio, and I remember looking at them in such a way, not fiercely and not staring, but I would look in a way that looked right into them. You know, I've learned how to stop doing that, but I would do that. And I remember this fellow, a French Canadian. None of you are French Canadians, but he ran screaming out of my studio after I looked at him in this way. I had a particular way of being that was extremely intense. That's the only way I can describe it. And you know, that's still there in the paintings. I've kind of learned how to modulate it, but in essence, what I like to do is confront people. And, you know, if I was allowed to keep speaking for maybe 2 or 3 days in this room, I would either drive you insane, but in a good way. I'd like to get down through the layers, you know, like the thick layers of peanut butter that people put all over the cracks to make it look good. I'm one of those people that likes to take a Bunsen. It's a bad thing in some ways because I can't really stop it, but I like to take a Bunsen burner, you know, or something, or a chisel, and I like to rip. I can't help it. I mean, and believe it or not, I mean, this is something you must be born with, because my family, my mother and father and poor brother, but I used to paint them, you know, and draw them, and they must have endured this treatment, you know, as a boy, you know, because I was really my mother was always layering on the makeup, you know. She was one of those ladies that taught cosmetic classes to other ladies, and, you know, she wouldn't appear until 12 noon, you know. It was like being in a kind of Mae West or Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, you know, one of those films, you know. She would go on for hours. In fact, perhaps my facility, I've often thought this as I get older, because you notice a lot of your parents in you as time goes by. My facility, which comes very bizarrely natural to painting faces, must have come from her ability to transform faces. You know, when she does wedding, you know, well, she doesn't do so much now, she's 80, but she would transform, you know, you'd see them coming in, they'd lie down and, you know, bang, out the cane. And perhaps, you know, witnessing that, you know, work, because I was painting a face before I came here today, and quite often I watch myself when I'm painting, and I'm just going, fucking hell. How can I mean, I'm astonished, and I'm going, how in the hell am I doing this? How on earth is this happening? You know, look at it. I mean, I'm not looking at anything. I'm kind of working with these stains, yellow ochre, burnt red oxide, burnt umber, white and red, and I'm, you know, just going, oh my God, you know, and it's starting to look really good, you know, and I'm starting to impress myself. That's when I know it's going good. But so I'm not really sure if I'm answering your question. I probably digressed hatefully. Yes, they're traps. You know, I mean, the work is on two levels. I'm obviously not just regarding myself as a painter. Prior to going to art school, I didn't take art that seriously, although I was top of the class in the high school. I wanted to become a big international film director, so I went to film school, and because I thought film is getting much bigger of an audience. It's you know, it does all these things, and that was me. I wanted to do that. So after that, going to London, I ended up learning all these philosophies. Basically, London for me was kind of like opening up a trap inside my head. I would go to the library, and this is serious, I would come out, I don't do it now, I would come out with like 20 frickin' books, with indigestible titles, you know, the Vitruvian Man and Existential Psychology. You know, I would actually read these books. I mean, I was omnivorous. And I couldn't stop myself doing it. I would just go on and on and on and on, reading these books and absorbing more. R.D. Laing coming out of my bloody veins. And then I started doing courses in London. I did everything you could think of. I mean, this was the early 80s, late 70s. I was doing Est, and I was doing Gurdjieff. I was doing, I say doing it, but I was learning all these things. And I was looking at the potential to transform human beings, really, and that's still that behind it all, that's the trap you end up in with my work. I'm really mainly concerned with transforming human beings. Right now, my main subject is myself. It's a never-ending story, and you know, there is innumerable layers to it. And I think the trap, sometimes you find yourself in the trap as the painter. And that recently happened to me. I found myself in a trap of my own painting. So it was like a Mobius strip. You know, it's quite interesting. It's a never-ending story. I think part of it is middle age. You know, I am now probably what's defined as a middle-aged artist. I don't feel like one, but chronologically I am. And at that point in time, a certain psychological shift takes place. A lot of the fuel that generated me to move this body and this body of work from, it's basically gone around the fucking planet. I mean, there's paintings come from Hong Kong, but a lot of the fuel that generated it was ego. Now, ego now is a negative word, you know, it's got negative connotations with it. But if you just think of ego as kind of like lens, you know, like the lens you're looking at things through. So that was the lens I was looking at things through, and it was the only lens I had available. It was either that or blindness. So I had to make that choice. Right now, this time, ego is changing. It's no longer the principal fuel. That's the trap I found myself in. I needed to move into something else. And I think this will come up this is a useful story. I mean, perhaps the older listeners will relate to this, but the younger listeners should know this. When I was young, the only people I was interested in were old people. Nowadays, the only people you're into, back to my selfies, you know, is this, and you'll learn very little from the selfie, other than yourself. But I was always interested in old people because they knew the fucking bullshit. They knew how to, and if they managed to, you know, I worked in an old folks' home and I left Wick, you know, teaching them art. And I thought, well, you know, I would sit and talk to them. I thought, this guy's 90. He has to know fucking something. He's been in the First World War. He's still interesting. He still talks. He's not all baked Dublin. He's not dead. So this fucker must know something. So I was always interested in that. Now I've let go of I haven't let go of the ego. I mean, I still have it. But what's happening is it's no longer the principal guiding energy. Something else is coming up. But I did find myself trapped by my own ego quite recently. You know, a certain thing happened. So, you know, it's the artist is not a supreme being guiding people, you know, omnipotently with these paintings. He is, or she is, in the process themselves of trying to discover things and trying to deal with the incredible act of being a human. That's really the principle behind it. So that's the trap, and it can be the viewer, it can be the man himself who thinks he has the trap. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming this evening. If you have any other questions, you can come up and ask Professor Scott. And again, thank you so much.
It's not an easy job curating a show for another artist, because I mean, Sarah is a very good artist in her own right. I mean, and it's but you know, it's tough, you know, and she took all these paintings, which were all coming in here. I mean, it's a higgledy-piggledy mess of paintings, and there's 15 years of paintings. And every time I come in, I just love seeing the juxtaposition. Tonight I looked at the painting, you know, the two windows there, and I'd never thought of that, you know, because there's years apart from those two paintings. One of them's got my ex-wife in a cafe window, and the other one's me with a pair of panties over my head. So there's a few years between them, but I'd never, you know, and suddenly now I see it, yeah, they're perfectly aligned together. And then the Cuban and the Mexican sitting there. And it's just juxtapositions in this room that Sarah's managed to kind of pull out of my somewhat kind of, you know, it's a chronology, call it a chaos of chronology or whatever, you know, but she's managed to really make sense of it. So I think Sarah's done a hard job, harder than me.